welcome to another edition of Technique Tuesday. This week we're going to talk about texture. Now we've talked about texture in other points of the year, using the texture mats and impressions and stamping, various different ways of creating texture. But we're starting to get into the sculptural part of the school year where you're going to be making depictions of things that exist in real life, and that's going to have to include some texture in some places. Things like animals, things in nature, these all have textures. You're going to have to do some experimenting to get different kinds of textures. Now I'm going to give you a guide on how to use some of these tools to create different kinds of textures. But you might have to do some experimenting on your own. But let's just get started. I'll show you some different ways to use some tools to get some different textures. So one thing that you may have to create, especially if you're doing some kind of animal, is fur. So after you've smoothed your project, it's nice and smooth. You can see my slab is very smooth on top. I've done all the smoothing. You want to do that first. I can start thinking about different kinds of texture. Now you want to keep in mind the size of your animal, if you're doing fur, and keep the fur in the same size range. So if you do a tiny little rabbit, keep the fur texture small. If you do a larger animal, keep it larger. You also want to keep in mind the length of the fur. If you are making a golden retriever, they have much longer fur than, say, a Doberman Pinscher. They have very flat, short fur texture, but they still have fur. So let's talk about fur. There's a few different ways you can make a fur style texture. One is by using a needle tool. And what you can do is, see how I'm holding my needle at an angle? I can create texture just by dragging the tool at an angle through the clay. I'm actually going to zoom in a little more and see if I can get that texture. Okay. So I'm holding the tool at an angle and pulling it through the clay and using short little strokes to create a short-haired animal fur texture. So this would be good for things like dogs with short hair, cats, rabbits, anything that has fairly short fur. Okay? So that's one way to do it, and I would just sort of cover the whole surface of my animal with a nice fur texture. Okay? Another way of going about doing this is by using a loop tool. Now, if you have an animal that it's a bigger animal and maybe it has longer fur, you may want to use a loop tool. And we have different size loop tools. This is actually, here's my hand. This is actually quite small. You've probably seen these in the bin, these larger ones. And then of course, we've got the very large loop tools. So there's a big range of tool sizes. And the size of the tool that you use is going to help determine the size of and shape of the fur. And when you're doing this, you want to kind of crisscross your lines over. If you get little bits and pieces like this, make sure you remove them and set them aside. And just scooping out and creating texture using a small loop tool. Okay? Larger loop tools, I'm going to do it down here. Larger loop tools will give you a different texture. Okay? If I was using the round one to create this one, and the larger the tool, generally the longer you're going to want the strokes to be with your tool. I can also go back and try to get a little more detail by using the corner of this more square loop tool. So this might be good for something like, again, an animal with long fur, maybe like a lion mane, something along those lines. So something a little more long. And I can also, of course, use my large loop tool to create great textures. And there's really no, way to do this perfectly. It's one of those things where you just have to be an artist. Another texture you might need is something like fish scales. And this tool, this round loop tool, is a great way to create fish scales. I'm just going to press it in and make little rows. And then I can go between my areas here. If I cover my whole project with these, I can get a fish scale. This is also great for the roofs on a house. So that's a great way to use that. Okay, so scales. And I also want to talk about just kind of experimenting. Some of you, when you start your artist recreation project, maybe you need to create something like clouds. There are a lot of just kind of different shaped sculpting tools. These don't have any specific purpose. They're just for sculpting, for creating different forms and shapes. So play around, roll out a little slab and play around and see what kind of things you can get. Maybe if I need to make a cloud or something, I'm going to kind of mush the clay around and kind of see what textures I can get out of the tool. Okay, using the pointed ends on the tool. Let me zoom in here. It's okay to experiment and figure out what's going to look good on your project, but don't just ignore the textures of things, okay? Texture is important. Texture is what's going to make it look more real and more interesting. Don't ignore the backs of the tool. So this is a small loop tool. You all seen these over there with the other materials, and you can create some pretty cool textures using this guy, just using the back of the tool. So just pressing it in, maybe with the tools or even a paintbrush handle. If you're making a flower, this is great for the centers of flowers to get that kind of seed texture. Poking at the clay with a tool, roughing it up. You can get grass for landscapes. Alright, so far this year you've used the serrated ribs almost exclusively for scoring and slipping. There we go. There we go. For scoring and slipping, but they're also a texture tool. Alright, I can make hair using these, or again, I can rough up to create textures for maybe animal skin. Okay, what happens when I brush over it with my finger now? If you have an animal that maybe doesn't have hair, perhaps a hippopotamus, you can get some great textures by applying a texture and then smoothing it down or going over it with a sponge as well. So play around with different textures, and use them on your projects. Take a look at the examples that are upcoming. And you don't have to strictly use ceramics tools either. You can use, this is a, let me zoom out. This is actually a pot scrubber. This is for scrubbing pots if you have dirty pots and pans. And this actually makes a pretty cool texture as well. So I can take this guy and kind of mush him on my clay and create a great texture for, again, maybe some kind of animal fur. I'm just going to make sure I take these little bits and pieces out. And I'm going to zoom in there so you can see it. That's really a great texture for all kinds of things. So experiment with other things you see around the room. If you see something that you think might work as a texture, then go for it. Give it a try.